again. It's the 25th of February 2022. There's an old Chinese curse, according to my husband, that runs like this: may you live in interesting times. Well, I think we're all pretty much living in interesting times, or we're about to. I don't know what's going on. I always used to think there's too many people in the world, we're consuming too much, we're destroying everything. The only solution appears to be to reduce the population by means of a plague and or a war. And guess what we're getting? First we get the plague, now we get the war. Maybe we won't get the war. But with Russia invading Ukraine, it certainly looks like more of a possibility than it has done for a while. I think about this now and again, and it seems to me there's very little anybody can do to protect against the horrors that might descend upon you unexpectedly. If you think about countries that are being invaded, as Russia is at the moment invading Ukraine, you think, well, how would the people in the town have managed to stockpile food for a start and weapons, and what good would it have done them? I think the tanks are coming in and there's going to be a bloody battle and the Russians are going to take over. And that's what happened in the past, you know? Countries invade other countries, they just take stuff. My grandfather was German. He was the director of a salt works in southern Germany before the First World War broke out. He had a posh home, he had 4 children, he had servants. And when the Kaiser decided to take Germany to war, my grandfather, who had quite a lot of money and was patriotic by nature, he bought a lot of government bonds to help the war effort. So what happened to those government bonds? They were supposed to be repaid after the war, but they ended up as worthless pieces of paper. He had also bought insurance policies for his children. He had 4 children, including my father, to the tune of 1,000 marks each. And after the war, these were down to about 1 mark each. So, you know, you can prepare and it can all go for nothing. It can blow away like dust. So I've been looking at my old dad's story. He did write some pages about his life reminiscences, but a lot of it was written in German and it was quite hard to decipher. And then recently I discovered that Google Translate will translate an entire document. So I thought I'd have a go, and I laboriously typed out the first 3 pages of this story of my dad's and uploaded it into Google Translate, and in a split second I got the document back again in rather strange Googleese, pidgin English. It is almost incomprehensible, but I know more or less what it says. So anyway, I thought I might share some of my dad's reminiscences. He was born on May the 26th, 1910, in a town called Wimpfen in southern Germany. The helper who was assisting his mother at the birth, apparently she was Catholic and it was Corpus Christi, so she had to rush off to church and abandoned my grandmother in the throes of childbirth. But luckily there was a doctor in attendance as well, and my father was born without mishap. So, of course, being in Germany, he was in the country of the aggressor in the First World War and probably would not have had the same experience as people in France, for example, children growing up in France. And indeed, he seems to have cheerful memories of the start of the war. He was 4 years old when it started. He remembers the troops coming through. According to him, the Triple Alliance was still in operation when the war started, and Italy was allied with Germany along with Austria-Hungary, and he remembered the Italian troops coming through on trains through his town on their way to fight in France, I guess. But then, of course, Italy withdrew fairly early on. So, as he recalls it, the first few years of the war seemed to be going fairly well, and everybody was patriotic, and whenever there was a small victory, they would ring the bells on the tower, and his mother played patriotic tunes on her piano. So as well as buying government bonds, his father gave up his gold watch chain for the war effort, and in return he got an iron chain and on the chain it was inscribed Gold zur Wehr, Eisen zur Ehre, which is gold for weapons, iron for honour. Where they were living in Wimpfen, not only did the troops pass through, but the trains stopped in Wimpfen and the townspeople were asked to come and bring supplies for the soldiers, the volunteers, whatever they were. So they brought fruit and they brought baked goods, and everybody was very cheery and positive, I guess. My dad thought the returning soldiers were friendly to the children they met, including him, because they had been called away to war and they hadn't had a chance to marry and start families of their own yet. But in any event, they were happy to be returning home for a little respite from the war, and the mood was buoyant, shall we say. But my dad also records that he could hear the sound of the shelling on the French side very clearly. And when the noise stopped, they knew that that was the time when the soldiers were going to have to climb out of their trenches and rush forwards and engage in hand-to-hand combat. My dad was talking about the rations. This could have been after the war. Everybody had a certain amount of potato rations, which they kept very carefully, and they weren't supposed to hoard them. But his dad, who had some foresight, he was thinking there'll be more hard times ahead, so we'll keep some of the potato rations, just in case we have absolutely nothing in a week or two. But what happened was the authorities sent round soldiers to inspect everybody's houses to prevent hoarding, and they took away this legitimate potato ration that had been kept on one side and left them with less than they should have had. So his father was forced to hide what he wanted to keep. Well, my mother used to say to us, in the war, that amount of jam would have had to last you a week, as a way of encouraging us to scrape out the remains of the jam from the bottom of the jar. Not that it did. And of course, she only experienced the Second World War, but my father experienced both, and this is probably why he wasn't very keen on the idea of having wars. Oh, they had spoils of war coming back from France. There was a horse and cart and a whole load of bales of hay, which his father bought for 10 marks, which must have been next to nothing. 2 horses and a cart and the hay as well. And so they were all excited, and they set out in this cart the next day to go on an outing. And the horses ran away with them, and they narrowly avoided crashing into the corner of a nearby castle. And his nursemaid was terrified that all the children were going to die. So the next day they sold it on. But the horses and the cart must have come from some poor French farming family that was left without anything, and then it was valued so little that it was sold on for a paltry 10 marks to Germans who didn't know what to do with it. So the Kaiser lost the war, and this was the end of the Prussian Empire, basically. The movement towards social democracy had the law behind it. As my dad said, the old way of thinking was still smouldering away underground, like a heath fire. And what kept it burning, sad to say, was the reprisals from the Allies. My father's uncle Otto, who was the brother of his father, was an engineer who was running a machining factory somewhere in the north of Germany. And this was taken over by the French after the war. And under some pretext, he was kicked out of his own factory and made homeless. So the whole family had to come and live with the cousins in Wimpfen, which was nice for the children because they got to play together. But it must have been a very hard time with 2 families in one household, having to find ways to make ends meet. And my father was saying that his favourite cousin was cousin Eberhard, that he became very close to and played with him a lot while he was there. And Eberhard later married and had 2 children, but in the Second World War, he went off to the Russian front and perished there. The French demanded drastic reparations, and this brought Germany to its knees, basically. And the economy was very, very slow to recover, and there was all sorts of undercurrents going on, and this was what led eventually to the rise of Hitler and the support for him, the popular support for him, which was due to having lived through times of great poverty and oppression that followed on from the efforts of the First World War. So, if we learn anything from that, I don't know what it is, I'm sure, because you can't stop people from invading. And just as Germany started to invade France in 1914, it seems that now Russia in 1922 is invading Ukraine. So the way I look at it is I can't do a lot about it. It's interesting to be living in these times and to be able to see what goes on, and I hope I shall live long enough to see what the outcome is, although it may not be very comfortable. But yeah, we're definitely living in interesting times. Anyway, see you next time. Bye.